I'm John Atack, as everybody watching knows, and this is Hoyt Richards, as everybody watching knows. Hi, Hoyt.
Well, nice to see you, John, as always.
Always a pleasure, really. And you have a topic for the day.
Yes, yes.
Usual.
I was thinking it would be fun to talk about how, because there's a lot of different formats now out there where people can kind of talk about this sort of subject matter. And so when is someone really ready to tell their story publicly? And is it a good idea? And at what point does it really serve someone? And what are the things to be concerned about that can be problematic? And I think it'd be fun to kind of talk about that journey. It certainly evolved for myself, and I'm very curious to hear your points of view as well on that, because in many ways, I think for me, it's been a gift that keeps giving, because I have talked about it a lot, but I've also can see situations where I've listened to interviews or I've seen television programs where I would say someone was maybe a little bit too early in the healing process to really be able to represent their experience accurately, because they haven't potentially emotionally processed what the experience has been. I think there's let's say one of the earlier steps is you can intellectually connect the dots and make sense of something where you can articulate parts of that, and it can make a lot of sense, and it feels good to talk about that. But the emotional processing of the trauma to the point of where it feels like you're effective at conveying what your experience was in a way that can be perceived as being healing rather than triggering, I think is a crucial kind of way to look at it. I had one friend who said she was thinking that when you've gotten to a place through your hard work through recovery and self-reflection and those type of things, you can tell your story in a very kind of unemotional way, from the point of view that you're still not reliving through the emotions as you retell it. And that allows the people hearing it to project onto the story their own emotions, not being fed kind of involuntarily, someone almost vomiting out their emotions because they're still kind of midstream of figuring it out. So I thought that's a good way to look at it as well. Like, there's always going to be certain things that I think make us emotional, but when you've done the work, you can kind of tell the story more objectively, in a sense, where you can kind of pass on the information without having it so layered with emotion that it may be unsettling, not only for you but for the audience that's listening.
Yeah, and I mean, it's noticeable to me. I've sort of kept away from the counter cult movement and pretty much been a one-man band, and I've over the years dealt with those people I wanted to deal with. So I've encountered a lot of people who are working in the counter cult field, and they seem to divide into various types. You have parents and friends who've come in because of an experience that's involved them, and they will of course have a perspective that they want to close the cult down. So it's an anti-cult. And that's absolutely understandable. Then you have people who've come out who feel vehement and vitriolic, and other words beginning with V, that they're upset, and as you say, they'll vomit out their experience. And again, there's an aspect of attack. Then you have people who have, and I have a terrible frustration with this. When back in 2015, when we started the Open Minds Foundation, I really thought that former members would flock to the standard and see that there was a general teaching about authoritarianism and abuse that needed to be in the world. But frankly, 95% of ex-members just cluster together in their own little pod, and then just keep attacking and talking about what happened to them. And that's totally sad, because they are triggering each other all of the time about how upsetting and nasty and horrible it was. I from time to time, people will call me an anti-Scientologist. And I take exception to this. I am against Scientology. I think it is dangerous. That's my experience of it. And I could talk to that for hour after hour after hour, and already have done on this.
Yeah.
But I'm pro-Scientologist. I did everything that I did out of the desire to help people who were enmeshed in this dangerous and destructive teaching. And unfortunately, many of the people in the counter-cult world, and I tell the same story again and again, because it's good to have the same stories to tell. My friend Carlos Cornier, who's a great documentary maker, and at the moment works a conga player in a band called Funkadisi, that Barack Obama is apparently quite keen on, the Chicago band.
Oh, wow.
But Carlos was in the Sea Organization down in Clearwater in the 1980s or something. And he'd been put onto the Rehabilitation Project Force, where it's the gulag, it's the labor force. You can't speak unless you're spoken to. You eat table scraps, and considering that the main meal will be rice and beans, table scraps aren't very good after that. You don't get a bed to sleep on down at the Clearwater establishment.
Wow.
And you have to dress in black, and you clean the toilets and do the humiliating work and confess your sins 2.5 hours every day for, probably 2 years, until you've been hollowed out completely. And he's toiling away doing this, and there's a protest going on, and one of the protesters spat at him. And I think that puts into focus this idea of the unhealed former member, that they now see everybody who's in the group as an enemy.
Yeah.
Rather than going, no, they're victims of
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's a fantastic point. And I've also observed people that when you're at the point, because I remember feeling this way, of where it was very important for me to vent of vent all the abuses that I had suffered, right? So and from that point of view, because I had a lot of suppressed anger.
I imagine, knowing your story.
Yeah.
My God.
Yeah, I had swallowed my words many times and my feelings just to survive, really, in those circumstances. But so there was this very cathartic period where I just not only had the opportunity to try to attack them, like, you're in a cult, you're all brainwashed, all this, but then also speak in similar terms to other people who were willing to listen of what my experience had been. But I wasn't at that place yet where I was able to really take on the accountability for my role in it as well. It was more this, I wanted to be vindicated. I wanted to be validated, to say, like, I had only good intentions, and things went all sideways, and it's almost that kind of undertone of, it's not my fault. And of course, listen, you can look at the same thing like a rape victim. They did not want to be raped. So I certainly understand. And I think that those are valid feelings, right? But I've learned over time that even if I had been an alcoholic, and I got in my car and drove drunk and killed someone, I can't say, well, listen, I was drunk, it's the illness, it's not me, I'm still responsible, I killed someone, right? So I think that's where further down the line, I was able to become more comfortable with the idea that, yes, I was under this toxic, abusive environment. I was brainwashed. I was being misled, and the influence techniques and manipulation, all sort of things. Those things were all going on, but I'm still accountable for everything that happened. I'm still accountable for everything I said, everything I did. I think the things that I probably sit even worse with me from a certain point of view are things that I didn't say, that I could have interfered, or things that I could have potentially stopped and I just remained silent. I think all those things probably contribute to the fact of why I want to talk about it a lot, even currently to today. It's very cathartic for me to kind of take ownership of of the experience, and not to remain silent, because I feel quite uncomfortable with those choices I made, whether influenced or not, to remain silent in the past. And I certainly know, and I say it all the time, that if you don't say anything, nothing changes. But if you talk about it, potentially information gets out there, and people can choose or not to assimilate it in some form or another, and maybe make healthier choices than I was able to make without that information. So that kind of is a thrust. But that's been a long and ongoing and forever evolving process. And I just think that's where, when you're at that point where you want to still feel vindicated on some level, that's I think a fine part of the process, to talk to friends and family. But in the public eye, it doesn't come off as well, because you're clearly not through that tunnel of processing the whole thing, and being able to talk about it with a little bit more accountability and a little bit more responsibility for your half of how the situation emerged.
And if we take the the situationist position in psychology, Philip Zimbardo is a situationist, and
Right.
the idea is, and you can see it, that we are single actors involved in a universe of activity, and there are pressures upon us. So when he spoke as an expert witness for Chip Frederick, Sergeant Chip Frederick, who was charged for the Abu Ghraib torture photographs, he put forward the point of view that he really was part of a chain of command that went right up to Don Rumsfeld, that the CIA had encouraged them to abuse the prisoners. So for example, the only clothing that Abu Ghraib prisoners were given were pairs of pink ladies' underpants, panties. Wow. And for an Arab man, this was, talk about machismo, this was severely, there were twice as many people in there as there should have been. There was a tower, so it meant that mortar fire from insurgents was directed there all the time. So it was a rotten, horrible place to be. And you have a situation that makes things worse. And I think we should always take into account that situation. If you add to that the deliberate methods, you, for example, suffered the hot seat, where people would verbally abuse you to within an inch of your life. And one can see that then has to be put into context. As you say, those are mitigating factors for the way we behave. But in dealing with Scientologists who were at the top of the group and who did awful things to people at Ron Hubbard's behest, it interested me very early on that some of them felt overwhelmingly ashamed and guilty for what they'd done. And some of them just said, as the Germans did at Nuremberg, Befehl ist Befehl, orders are orders. I was just doing what I was told. And I think taking that responsibility and saying, but I was present while it happened, and it was my hand that held the gun, is very necessary. And finding a balance where you overcome the shame, the persistent shame, and accept that you were guilty of that particular thing. And if you think of it in court terms, you'd be saying, well, yes, I did do it. I did commit the act, actus reus, as they say in Latin. But the mens rea, the intention to commit the act, wasn't really there. The intention came from the leader or from the outside, at which point your responsibility in law becomes a very interesting, were you really responsible? And I think it's, as you say, it's the degree of responsibility that you have to own what you contributed and what you did.
Yeah, and I think the shame thing is a huge component of it, right? I mean, because I think, and Brene Brown talks about this a lot. I think you're familiar with her. Are you familiar with Brene Brown? She's a research writer, and she's written several books about shame and the way that the primary antidote to shame is vulnerability, which is being able to own your story and tell it, and be quite transparent about it. It's that process that allows you to heal and not feel, and recognize there's valuable lessons learned from this experience if you own it. You know, it's this type of thing of, you know, I've learned from trauma that trauma never goes away. You either choose to deal with it or you don't. And if you don't, it will find ways to sabotage you because it needs to be dealt with. Or you can take it head on, and it can be an incredibly worthy journey, in my opinion, to find a place that you feel somewhat at peace with, because you've kind of investigated what were the dynamics at play that led to these events that led to the trauma that you experienced, and take away the lessons learned. And I think that's a huge part of it, is this, you know, through that, overcoming the shame and recognizing that on some level, as horrific as what you may have experienced may have been, if looked at with the proper, you know, or with a kind of a inquisitive lens, it can become incredibly this wealth of knowledge to kind of teach you about not only yourself but the world we live in, and can become this powerful reference point that can serve you going forward in multitudes of ways of knowing that not only did you get yourself in a situation you never imagined, you also found your way out of it in some way. And that journey, I think, you know, the survivor kind of experience allows you to almost start to wear this as a badge of honor, that you survived this, and you can kind of tell, you know, live to tell the tale type of thing. And there's this sense of almost duty that you feel that you want to contribute the lessons learned from this experience, because why would you have gone through them and then just keep them to yourself? And I think that's a time when you're potentially more prepared to talk about something publicly, because there's been a resolution that you've arrived to where things, you know, the waters have mellowed to a point where you can kind of just explain the process without having to, as we talked about earlier, re-trigger yourself and even telling the events because it still feels too raw. And you know, and I think that's really where, you know, the rubber meets the road of the better you are at being able to be transparent and honest and candid on just kind of how bad it got, and how maybe badly you performed within that context of what you said or did, and just being honest. People are infinitely forgiving when you come from that point of view. If you hedge your bets and say, well, I really didn't totally buy in, I really didn't do this, and I knew they were bad, it wasn't really me, then you come off really, really poorly. And so I think that's the kind of transition that starts to happen, where you realize that if I'm just honest and I just talk about how I really thought back then and how I acted, and yes, it was under influence, but just own it, then people are incredibly supportive. But if you still feel you need to be vindicated and validated, like it wasn't your fault and that you were only the victim, because you know, the victim part of it is part of it, but it can't be all of it. And you know, it's that transition from the victim to the survivor that I think starts to build the confidence that the situation actually in some ways you know, has silver linings that become this benefit for you to own and enjoy going forward as something that taught you valuable lessons
and gave you tools to help people. If you can understand, you know, what happened. Somebody recently, a week or so back, in comments on the channel here, I think with Chuck Beatty, who's a wonderful man, and he said, shouldn't we have a kind of what somebody else in the comments called cults for dummies? So you could have this list of cults and kids could look at it and say, well, you shouldn't join any of these. And my response was to say, well, I think it's better to understand the characteristics of human predators, the techniques they use, how to see through propaganda and see whether things are truthful. And it made me think about the old adage about you know, it'd be much easier to walk if the whole world was covered in leather, or you can have shoes. You know, And
right.
and you remind me of a friend of mine, sadly late friend, long since passed, Shona Foxness, who was an absolutely wonderful, vibrant woman. And she came to me one day and she said exactly what you said, that she'd never really believed it. And so, I don't know, I knew her well enough to say it. And I said, so you sold your business, gave all the money to Scientology, went to Los Angeles with your 8-year-old child, put your child into the keeping of people who had no concern or ability to look after children. In fact, the children roamed wild. Works a 90-hour week, were paid $10 a week. I hate to think what you'd have done if you'd actually believed in it. You know?
Well, how did she respond to that, right? I mean,
she laughed. And she later came along and said that I should stop wasting my time helping Scientologists because they've pulled it in, the Scientology expression for karma, you know. And so that was immediate. It was, so if you see a 4-year-old child going in front of a car, do you stop them or do you say they pulled it in? You know, it's their karma.
Oh boy. Yeah. Oh boy. Yeah.
So we make choices. I think, and also the greatest of all survivors, Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, a book that anybody who thinks they've had a hard time should read, you know, what being schooled in Dachau and Auschwitz was like. And this man managed to take something absolutely positive from that experience. And at the end of the book, very short, very readable book, Joseph Campbell called it an ambrosial book, which is why I read it. And towards the end of the book, he says that after getting out of Auschwitz, he and a fellow inmate were walking through a cornfield, and this guy picked up a stick and started thrashing the corn down. And Frankl was like, "What are you doing, this destructive act?" And he said, "After what's happened to me, I have the right to do anything." And that's another aspect, bad aspect of the survivor, that where they become predatory because of the experience they've had. They become unforgiving and sociopathic in their behavior. And you do see some of that in the countercult field. People are just so angry about everything that they want to destroy it. And if you disagree with them, they'll go after you, you know?
Well, it's true. And you know, the pathology even of any sort of cult leader or is not unlike the pathology of a serial killer, where they, you know, somewhere in their youth, they were made to feel they were either abused or abandoned on some scale of trauma where they felt, you know, helpless. And unfortunately, because of that severe trauma that they encounter, certain personalities, not everyone, can develop just what you're describing, this kind of outlook where they're now looking for situations where they can feel powerful and put someone else in the position that they felt of hopelessness and helplessness, but they're the ones now pulling the strings, and that for them feels good. And that's where the disconnect is, right? Where the more normal psyche would be like, well, I clearly am influencing and manipulating and abusing this person. This can't be good, but that certain kind of pathology of like you're describing, that person feels that they need to be, you know, the world owes them on some level, and they have to now reverse the table and be in the position of the abuser. Somehow feels right to them. I don't know how the best way to frame it, but that begins that whole process of where they can, and it's like a learning computer. It gets better as they refine it. I mean, it's a fascinating pathology that you know, that you encounter, because I try to explain to people that usually when you're dealing with these type of personality types, that they're not putting off the normal signals of someone who manipulates and lies at will, because they've blurred in their own mind what is truth and what's lie as a coping mechanism. So it's very hard, as you on the receiving end of it, to identify in the normal terms that this person may be pulling a fast one over me or manipulating me or lying to me flat out. it just doesn't send off the same signals. So it's interesting how that kind of evolves, and that's why I think, again, it's important to own your half of how this thing happened, and find peace at that, of recognizing on some level that, yes, not unlike the rape victim, and where I didn't actively seek out to want to go through something that was absolutely painful and horrible and traumatizing, but can I learn from this? Can I become a better version of myself? Can I develop a certain level of compassion and empathy that I wouldn't have otherwise, from being on that side of the abusee, where you've suffered things that you felt were completely out of line and uncalled for? What, like you're talking about Viktor Frankl, what's the positives I can take from this experience and grow and learn, and on some level create some method to the madness, in essence.
And Frankl, of course, went on with, he was a psychiatrist, and he went on with to develop logotherapy. He'd been a strenuous opponent of Freud even before the Second War, and he continued with that. And I have a friend who's a professor of psychology, and when I asked her what her favorite book was, she said it's The Doctor and the Soul by Viktor Frankl, because he addresses a serious problem in psychotherapy, which is that psychotherapy tends to be non-spiritual. And I'm an agnostic, so that doesn't particularly matter to me. Right. I would, as Eric Fromm said, say that I'm a mystical agnostic. I'm still seeking for the truth, but I frame it in my own way. But the understanding that if somebody does have a system of belief, that you should be able to accommodate that. And if you're seeking to help them, and I got myself involved in a court case where I needed character witnesses many years ago, 25, 30 years ago. And I asked two close friends to write character references for me. And I didn't give them any instruction about what to write. They both happened to be Christians. And they both said the same thing, which is that I had helped them with their faith, though not a believer myself. Because my perception is that it is so easy to overwhelm a person in counseling, so that they then want, the transference, as Freud called it, they want to imitate you. They want to know, at the end, long ago when I used to do interventions, it was quite common at the end for the person to say, what do you believe? And I'd say, you really don't want to know, because my life's a complete mess, and you don't want to end up like me doing this kind of job, and I usually got away with that. But I do see human life in very simple terms, that it's a process of growing up. It's a process of maturity, and that we live in a society that doesn't want us to grow up. It's a consumer society. It wants us to believe the bullshit that politicians are talking without questioning it. It wants us to buy lots of stuff, despite the fact that's destroying the environment. And they want to tell us stuff about how we're destroying the environment that destroys the environment. And do a minimum of thinking, and certainly flock together and get into the swarm, and go along with things. And it's so adolescent, our society. And so I think I often recommend a book called Raising Parents by Patricia.
Yes, you've recommended it before,
and I just love the model that she calls it the dynamic maturational model. And that the first thing you look at is not to diagnose somebody psychiatrically, but to say, how mature are they? Now, I certainly feel that for myself. I'm 67 years old, and I've managed not to grow up yet. But and I think there are certain aspects of the childlike perception which are a good thing. The enjoyment, the joy that one can take in life, the innocence, that can be a good thing. But taking responsibility for what we do, and trying to do something that helps, understanding, and for me this is foundational, that happiness is something that comes when people reflect back to you that you've done something helpful for them, that they're, one of the best things that's ever happened to me was a letter, which I've talked about many times. And this letter, the first line was, "You probably don't remember me." And I don't. To my shame, I do not remember this woman at all. I spent an afternoon with you 15 years ago, and my life was in turmoil. And from that day on, I am now happily married, have a family, I have a career, and I've had a great 15 years because of that catalytic encounter.
Wow.
And to think that, you participated in that, you were able to be there for somebody so that they could grab hold of the reins of their life and head somewhere and get away from the trauma. That's a marvelous thing. That's a wonderful thing. Whereas the sort of pleasure, thrill-seeking aspect, which is the immature way of life, infatuation, the I want to order this thing from Amazon and I'm absolutely in love with it, and by the time it arrives I want to order something else from Amazon. There's that just grabbing at life and trying to
impulsiveness.
And which is not to say that we shouldn't eat the best quality chocolate and drink the best quality. I'm going to say Prosecco because champagne is too expensive for me. Absolutely, that to have a puritanical life, an absolute waste. And I'm pretty sure if there is a God, that God would be kind of looking down and going, "I gave you all this beautiful stuff. Why are you so miserable?" But there is that in people. But happiness itself comes from the what you've been able to give to others. And so teaching that as a method, and again my frustration with ex-members that they spend their time bitching about the experience, and never getting over it, and not realizing that we have the power from our experience. We've done the hero's journey, been into the dark bit of the wood and got the wound, come out. And it's the first mention of psychotherapy that I know in the West, and it's in the year 1210, and it's in the book Pathology, written by Wolfram. I actually wrote a novel which I've yet to publish, which is based on this. So I got very interested in this, that the way that the Fisher King is healed is by somebody saying, "How did you get your wound?" So that's the origin of the talking cure. Tell us how.
No, and the king suffers from a greatly crippled feeling function, right? I mean, that's really what that whole Fisher King and Parzival. It's a fascinating story because it really is psychotherapy laid out brilliantly. I mean, it's wild, and I think this is what goes back to one of the points you said earlier that really resonated with me, is this: when you consider maturity, and I think about just like the challenge of the teenage years, and that peer pressure element, and that feeling of like not wanting to stick out in the crowd, wanting to kind of go along with the flock, and that safety in numbers, and it's a very primal part of our DNA encoding. It's obviously tied to our ability to survive, is that there is safety in numbers. There is a chance to kind of succeed, knowing that you've got like-minded people around you, that you feel protection. And I think the maturity starts to come around the point where you start saying, well, what do I really think? And how do I really look at the world that may be contrary to what the group or the society or the flock is telling me? And that challenge to kind of become a leader in your own life, to even identify who you are, what makes you tick, what really would make you happy. I think, one of the other points you bring up, everyone's really responsible for their own happiness, and we don't really have the ability to give someone else happiness. I think that's where relationships in general can greatly suffer, if we think, oh, if I find the right partner or the right person, then I'll be happy, as if it's their job to make us happy. And that's not really the way I think it operates. You certainly would want to be with someone who's encouraging and supportive and loving, but ultimately the only one that can determine whether we experience that feeling of satisfaction or happiness it's on us. And so in the same way, that journey as the individual of trying to figure out where do I stand as an individual apart from the crowd, apart from the society, where is not only my moral compass and my value system, but what is the footprint I leave behind based on the choices and actions that I'm doing right now. And I think that requires a level of maturity, and it's hard work, but I find incredibly gratifying, and it's an ongoing. It's not like you arrive to some point and say, "Oh, got this part figured out." I mean, that's one of the things I've really realized, that where we get ourselves in hot water, and we've talked about this in the past. I know that once you've arrived to some narrative where you think, "Oh, this is it, you can check that box, I've got that part figured out," then you're put yourself in real hot water, because
now enlightened.
Yes, because you can certainly lean in towards something, say, this seems to be a truth, or whatever way you want to frame it. This seems to be a consistent thing that emerges. But once you lock it in, you stop taking in the new information. And even if you're leaning into something that, well, it looks like that could be the truth, you still benefit from taking in information and testing that continually, because you just never know. And that's a real healthy operating critical thinking mind, versus someone that just, and I'm guilty of this back in the day, and still at times, just wanting to kind of check a box and put it away and focus on something else. And it's really hard to remain open-minded and in that kind of eternal student mode, and be quite comfortable with saying about a lot of things that you just don't know. Still investigating, still trying to figure these things out. And I think that even that concept of, oh, I'm going to get to a place where I have it all figured out, that's a trap. I think, yeah. I mean, the fact that of relishing the feeling of being right, that's a trap. I think all these things are really, really important things to think about. And this again goes back to our initial thing about telling your story in public. I think these are things you need to investigate before you put your life out there in a certain context where you're going to be okay with however it's received, because you can't control that. But if you've got an agenda of what you're hoping to achieve and telling it, it can probably be disappointing, because very often it doesn't go that way.
Yeah, I mean, coming back to the point about finding someone or something that will fulfill you, Eric Fromm in The Art of Loving has a wonderful analogy where he says it's like saying that you want to be a painter, and you're going to wait until the right subject matter comes along, and then you'll be able to paint it.
Right.
You actually have to, and he's saying the same is true with love. You have to learn how to love. Care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge, the 4 elements that he gives for love, which I think is a beautiful definition to say, you should care for, you should have respect for, you should have knowledge of, and you should take responsibility for the person with whom you're in love. And that should be running both ways. I don't generally agree with Jung. I think he was a dreadful narcissist and a very destructive human being. So there you go. That's what I think about him. But he did say that love can only exist between 2 people. And I thought that was a wonderful insight, that if you're saying, oh, come back to me and love me, it's over, it's done. It has to be a reciprocal feeling. And all too often, I realized as I was about 13, and I realized how much of our music, our pop music, is about being deserted and abandoned and begging somebody to come back.
Yeah, right.
Or the infatuation of that first moment, when I saw her standing there. And all of this stuff and so many pop songs are actually about having been in a borderline relationship, you know, how badly you were treated, but how you want the person to come back and treat you badly.
Right. Yeah.
It's strange. And
No,
having lived through it, you know.
Yeah, well, it's a great point you raise, because I've learned over life, and had some good mentors that basically said, when someone reveals himself to you, pay attention. And with the concept of seeking a healthy, loving relationship, if someone is in essence telling you that they don't want to be with you, why would you want to be with someone who doesn't want to be with you? I mean, that's so. Yeah, you have to pay attention. You have to listen and recognize what, like you're saying, if it's not reciprocal, if it's not something you both feel is coexisting at the same time, and you're on different pages, it's an incredibly painful experience. And to, not to say that it's all, rainbows and gumdrops all the time, but it is that type of thing of trying to find that partner that really feel you're being seen, you're being heard, and you're being loved in the way that you want to be loved, and you're able to love them in a way that you feel it's being received in the way that you intended to be. And that is very hard to find, very hard.
Yes, and it should be easier. I mean, as you know, for the last 10 years or so, my whole focus has been on prevention, understanding, right. Having been involved in, with about 600 people in recovery, some for, as with the woman who wrote to me just for an afternoon, one right. guy was 34 years of coming and going before he turned around and said, and he'd long since left the Scientology mother cult, but he right, still right. clung on to some of these ideas. And it took that long for him, because I'm not here to, open somebody's head up and tinker in it and change them. That's got nothing, that's not it at all. That's very much what Scientology seeks to do. I'm here to urge a process of thought so that the person will go away and work it out for themselves, because if they're not working it out for themselves, it's of no use whatsoever. Like the various psychotherapies that use hypnotic means,
right.
eye movement desensitization and whatever, EMDR, which there's all of this stuff. Tens of thousands of people have trained in this, and the following somebody's finger and thinking this thought. The problem is that intellectually you are not understanding what the trauma meant. And so my suspicion is that while you may get spontaneous remission for a period of time, that trauma is not dealt with. And it may help you to get to a point where you can deal with it. The problem again is that the therapist is saying, right, now you're done.
Yeah.
We have to understand life, and we have to understand it on our own terms, not as somebody else's rule book says we ought to understand it. And that does take quite a considerable amount of experience and thought. I personally don't think it's a specifically intellectual process. The third patriarch of Buddhism, Ananda, who is the man who remembered all of the sutras, and they all were recorded by him, and he passed them on. But he did not attain enlightenment, even though he traveled with the Buddha for 40 years or something. And the second patriarch turns around him, and there is a convention among Buddhists that what you do is two groups of monks put up a flagpole, and they will argue two sides of an argument. Right. And when one side has won, the other side chops down the flagpole. And the second patriarch looked at Ananda and said, chop down the flagpole, Ananda. So his problem was that he was over-intellectualizing. So I am not, and I've long been aware of that problem. It's not that. It's actually having a coherent experience of the world. And for me, coming to and this is perhaps temperamental and it's perhaps genetic as well, but coming to the part in my own life, having gone through all sorts of struggles and difficulties, being harassed by Scientology for 16 years didn't help.
Right.
And, having been physically ill and having overcome, for a long period of time and overcoming that there is a sort of, and, who knows how long it will last for, but there is a coming together where, the conflicts that I suffered from have evaporated, and that my life, from one day to the next is generally a pretty happy existence. I'm very lucky because I have the support of family and friends,
right,
and the goodwill, and I live in a nice house and things like that. So I'm extraordinarily lucky, and I accept that, before you've achieved a certain material level where you're going to eat every day and not be baked to death by the sun or frozen,
right.
that you have to get beyond those things. You have to get those things. But then it is for us each. I'm at the moment, I'm reading about Steve Bannon, and
Okay, yeah.
dreadful Steve Bannon. And it fascinates me that he considers himself to be spiritual, and he considers, this is a man who ran Donald Trump's original election campaign through Cambridge Analytica. And he is weaving together, it's a book by a professor called Benjamin Teitelbaum, who interviewed Bannon for tens of hours over a long period of time to try and understand his views. And then he's trying to say that he is spiritual rather than materialistic. And I'm immediately going, well, unless people can eat, what you're calling materialistic means physical survival. And what he's calling spiritual, I don't understand at all. I don't know what he means by spiritual. He says it's something to do with Christianity, but he doesn't seem to me to be a very Christian person. And those contradictions where people are seeking to insist that if you don't believe in Yahweh, Jehovah, Allah, Buddha mind, Devi, Shiva, what have you, if you don't believe in these things, then you are part of a deviant out group, and it's only people who use these names and behave in this way. I'm much more taken to people who believe that we should behave in a positive manner towards other human beings and regard ourselves as part of a single species. Somebody was arguing with me. I did a thing with Yuval where he said there's no such thing as race, but there is such thing as racism, which I thought was a wonderful expression. Because this guy comes onto the comments section and says, so you admit that there is race, there are races, because you said, here, and it's, well, in the sense of there are breeds of dog, but there are all kinds of wolf, and there are breeds of human, but we're all part of the same species. And we really ought to get past this idea of the color of skin or the ethnicity and get on with doing things that are positive for humanity, rather than saying, right, we're pan-Slavic, so we're going to take over Ukraine, or we're pan-German, so we're going to take over Austria, or we're pan-American, and so we're going to exterminate the natives and throw out the Mexicans. So I was surprised to find the other week, I didn't know this, when the Mormons went to Salt Lake City under Brigham Young, I didn't know it was part of Mexico, or more Mexico.
At that time, it was.
So that far north was still, into the 1840s, a part of Mexico, Tejas. I hadn't even thought, it's Tejas. We shouldn't say Texas, it's Tejas. So the idea of building a wall when a third of the United States was actually populated by Latinos. And it was taken over, when the California Purchase happened and the Florida Purchase. This tiny little place that had fought this war against England, Britain, expanded by the Louisiana Purchase, and then the conquest. Remember the Alamo? That's the time when we grabbed land from these people. Let's build a wall and keep them out. This idea of these ethnicities, and which is all very nice for people to maintain such things. I was in South Africa, and my driver, my friend there, said it's a terrible shame that the tribal people were losing their culture. And the thought had never struck me. We have this thing in the UK called Morris dancing. You may have encountered it, where people dress up in white suits and have bells around their knees and poles, and they bang them against each other, and it's meant to go back to the Middle Ages. And it suddenly struck me that perhaps what was being said, that we should make sure that everybody in England does Morris dancing, because we mustn't lose our culture. So what is this culture? What is this fluid thing? Do we identify ourselves with, you know, the sun dance, or, you know, the sacrifice by ripping people's hearts out? Which are the bits that are important? And for me, it's the fact that we are human, and that we should be doing those things with our environment to make sure that future generations can survive, rather than the constant battle that says, I'm better than this person because I've got red skin and they've got yellow skin, or I've got green skin and they've got blue skin, or what have you, which is a cultic way of looking at the world. This division between my group and anybody else's group, and makes people miserable, you know, definitely makes people unhappy. Still, I think we've kicked this about a bit, haven't we?
I think we have. I think we've done a good job. It's I think the big takeaway is, you know, until this feels like something that you're almost experience a compulsion to share, then you're probably not at the place where you should be talking about it publicly, you know. And the compulsion comes from the desire to share the lessons learned and how this has become a valuable experience, rather than one that just you attach a lot of shame and pain and misery to, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you used the phrase badge of honor, and the first time I met you remotely was you had a conversation with Steve Hassan, which I watched, and you talked about it being a badge of honor, and that really struck me, that absolutely we've been through something, we've been wounded severely in certain ways, and we've recovered from those, and we can now help people to either preferably not suffer those wounds, or to recover from them. And as you say, it's a matter of, I would never recommending that somebody does a media interview. The first newspaper interview I did in March 1984 with the Daily Mail, and the guy stopped me, the reporter stopped me, he said, "John, you don't understand. I want a victim and a picture." And that stayed with me. I've done more than 200 media pieces since then, lots of documentaries, but nearly everybody that approaches me wanting something, they want a victim and a picture. They want, you know, at best it's going to be edutainment. There's no serious intent to help people there.
Caution in those scenarios.
Caveat emptor. Grand. Well,
good.
Lovely talking with you as always, Hoyt.
Always, John. It's always my pleasure. And you know, keep things you know, running smoothly over there on the other side of the pond.
I do, yes. I maintain all of it beautifully.
Okay, great.
And for anyone that hasn't actually been kind and caring enough yet, please make a Patreon subscription, because otherwise this channel will vanish and disappear. Since I started prompting people to do this, we've more than doubled our number of patrons, and Spike is now actually able to eat one hamburger every week.
Oh, good. We want Spike to have those burgers for sure.
And they're probably vegan burgers, you know.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. I hear you.
Okay, thanks a lot.
We'll see you next time, John. All the best. Lots of love.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.